Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave, and this tutorial is part of a Learn React tutorial series. I will give a link to the full playlist in the description below. In today's tutorial, we're starting the second challenge of the series now that we've learned about useEffect and fetching data with the Fetch API. Now we're going to go to this website, JSON-Placeholder.typicode.com, and we'll use the resources from this free fake API to request these resources, of course, with Fetch. If I scroll down, we can see the resources listed here. We're going to use posts, comments, and users. Now, if we click on one of the resources, it will give us the full link, which is just based on the root URL of the website and then / posts, comments, or users. But you can see all the JSON data right here in the browser by doing so. Hit the back button and come back to this site. But again, you'll need JSON-Placeholder.typicode.com for these resources, and you'll want to remember those resource links. From there, let's look at the challenge. Now, this is a two-part challenge, so I'm going to introduce part A now, and I'll introduce part B later in the tutorial. So right now, as we build out part A, we want to look at this result, and we have 3 buttons at the top, and you can see I have users selected. When I select users, it requests the associated resource from the JSON placeholder website, and then it prints a list of all of the objects we get back. And notice these are the full objects that we get in JSON format here, and each one is a list. You can tell by the bullet points, it's just an unordered list on the page. But if I click posts, the whole presentation changes, and now we're displaying the posts. Likewise, if I click comments, we're now displaying a list of all of the comments received. And so that is part A of the challenge. Create this same application that provides these different resources on the page at the different button clicks. Now I'm going to give a couple of hints for this part A, so if you want to complete this without the hints, go ahead and pause the video now and work on the completion. And of course, after the hints, I will start to show the solution. Okay, hints for part A. If you don't want to hear these, make sure you have paused the video. Part A requires you to print a list of each of the objects you receive, all these JSON objects. And of course, you're going to use useEffect, and anytime one of these resources changes, users, posts, or comments, you will want to run what's in useEffect. So the dependency for useEffect should be the request resource, or as you change part of that request. So users, posts, or comments would be changing, and then useEffect could run the same fetch to request either one of or any one of these resources. So that should help you. Also remember, as you display objects in the web page, you'll need to use JSON stringify. You can't just display JavaScript objects. You need to stringify those objects. So that could also be a little hiccup if you weren't aware of that. So use JSON.stringify, and then you can display the objects. So with those hints, go ahead and pause this and complete the challenge to the best of your ability. And then I will go over the solution before introducing part B of this challenge. Okay, to start the challenge, I've got Visual Studio Code open. I am in my React series folder that has all of the tutorial folders here, so I want to be in a parent folder is what I am saying. And then I am using npx, and I'm going to type create-react-app, and then I'm going to type 15 tut. You can name your folder for your project whatever you want to, but that's what I'll name it. I'll press enter and start the create react app process. This will take a little while, so I'll come back when this completes. Okay, create react app has finished. We have our happy hacking message. And now remember, we're still in the parent folder, so we need to go to the file menu and then open folder. And from there, we should be able to choose. We've got React series, and then I'm choosing my 15 tut, whatever you named your folder. And let's open that in Visual Studio Code. Okay, we have our new project folder open. I've got Visual Studio Code on the left, I've got Chrome on the right, and I have the JSON placeholder site here for reference. Let's go ahead and do a little cleanup here at the beginning of the project. In the source folder, I'm going to select the app.css, the app.test.js, the logo, the report web vitals, and the setup tests.js, and I'm going to press delete just to get rid of those files. After that, in the index.js, I'm going to select everything at this bottom of the file here where it has the comments and report web vitals, and just hit backspace to get rid of that. I'm also going to remove the import for web vitals. Now I'll save the index.js file. And in the app.js, I'm going to remove both imports at the top of the logo and the app.css. We don't have those files any longer. I'm also going to select everything between the div that has the class name of app and just hit backspace to delete that. So we've basically cleared out our app.js, and now we're ready to begin building our own project. At the top of the app.js, I'm going to import a couple of hooks that we're going to use. So I'll import useState and useEffect, and these will both be from React. After that, we can come into the app function, and I'm going to define the API URL. So I'll have const and then API_URL, and I'm going to point that at the web address that we get from JSON type holder, so I can just, or JSON placeholder, excuse me, so I can just paste that in from the web. I'm going to press Control B right now to hide the file tree, and now we can see the full code. And I don't need to add the resource after that because that's something we're going to change. So this will work right now, but remember, as we change the resources, this will say posts, users, or comments after this address. So right now, we just have that. Now let's think about the state we're going to use, because we're going to change the resource type, or we could call it the request type, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'll say const, oh, I need lowercase, and then I'm going to say REQ for request, and then type in camel case, and then of course set request type. And from there, we'll set useState, and I'll set the first type to users. It's going to be one of three. It could be users, posts, or comments. You could do any one of those three. I'm going to start with users. From there, we need to think about what we get in return. So we'll get some data, or we could call each piece of data that we get items, and that's what we did previously in a project. So let's go with items. We'll just say const, we'll have items and set items, and this will be the data that we get back, so really our objects that we get, but it will be an array, and it would be a JSON array. So we get the array that has the JSON objects within it, and there's our state. Really, that's all we need. So we can save that much. And while we haven't worked on the display yet, we can go ahead and just create some logic, because we've done this before. We know what we're doing here. We've just got useEffect, and it has an anonymous function, and inside this anonymous function, we can then specify a dependency at the end. This, of course, an empty array would just make it happen at load time, but that's not what we want. We want this useEffect to take place anytime the request type state changes, because it's going to be one of three things: users, comments, or posts. So this is our useEffect, and it will actually run every time our request type changes. So now we need to put our fetch items function inside of the useEffect, and then of course call that function. So we'll start with a definition of fetch items. And oh, this needs to be async. There we go. And we'll make it an arrow function. Now inside the fetch items function, I'm not going to get as detailed, at least in this solution, as I did in a previous project tutorial where we build out our list, but we'll get the basics here. So we're getting a response. We're going to await a fetch call, and the fetch call will be to the API URL, but remember, we need to add a little bit to that. Oh, and I'm showing me errors because I didn't put an equal sign. There we go. And now we need the API URL and a template literal, and this will allow us to add a little more to this API URL at the end, because remember, we need to change the resource. Now we have the slash already up here in the API URL, so we don't need to put a slash here, but what we do need to put is the request type, whether it's users, comments, or posts. So we put those two together and we get the fetch URL that we need. After that, let's just define data, and we'll set that equal to, we need to once again await, the response.json. I almost said data there, but we've got the response, we change it to JSON, and then there is our data. And then we can just set our items equal to the data. Now, I'm not putting in the line where we would check to see if the response is okay or not, or create a separate error and handle those. But if you did that in your solution, that's great. That's just going the extra step here for a challenge project. What I'm going to do for any errors that we would get that wouldn't be fetch or returned in fetch is just to say error. And of course, we know in a serious project, we should check to see if the response is okay, log an error, and not set the items, as we've seen in the previous tutorials. But this is the basic fetch here with the try-catch block, and now all we need to do at the bottom is call fetch items. Again, this isn't returning anything. We don't have a return for data, so we don't really need to await this fetch here. If we did, we could use an instantly invoked function and await the return of this fetch. But that's not needed, so just put the semicolon after that call and save, and we've really completed our useEffect that will fetch these different resources as they change. And now we've essentially handled the logic here in our function for the app component. So we need to think about the display. And what do we want to display here? Well, we're going to have, and we could do comments, or we'll just discuss because it's very small. We'll just have two components that come in here. So we'll have a form component, and in the form component we're going to pass the request type, so we can specify that now. And after the request type, we're also going to pass the set request type, and so we'll go ahead and specify that now as well. There we go. And then we can just close out the form. And then after that, we'll also have a list, but let's work on the form for now. So I'm going to go ahead and expand Visual Studio Code to take up the full window for just a minute. And then Control B as in boy to show the rest of the file tree. And now we'll just create that form component. And here I'll type form.js. And now using the snippets that we've installed, the extension for React, I can press Control Alt and the letter R, and then it's _ RAFCE. Now this is a shortcut, it's not necessary. You could just type out the code for this functional component here, as you see for form. It's just generic code, and it's an arrow function. Now our form is going to receive those two props that we were passing down. So it was request type, and I'm destructuring up here instead of specifying props and then using .props. So I've got request type and set request type. And then in the return, instead of a div, we're going to have a form. And for this form, oh, and I use capitals, that's why it's green. What we really need is lowercase. So I'm going to select both of these and say form. There it recognizes it as an HTML element. So again, use lowercase. My bad there, but we'll have an on submit and have this equal to an anonymous function that has the event. And here we'll just say e.prevent default, because we do not want the default submit that reloads the page every time a button is clicked. So that easily eliminates that possibility. And now our form is going to contain buttons, but we haven't really created those yet. So let's save this. And we didn't save our app over here because we had the form, but we hadn't imported it. So at the top of our app.js, let's import form from .form. There we go. And we can save that. And now if we look back at the form once again, this is where we need to put our buttons. So without putting those in here, let's just go ahead and create a button component that will be reusable, because we're going to have 3 buttons. And we'll do the same thing here, Control Alt and the letter R. Now _ RAFCE. And now we have a functional button component. Let's just go ahead and save the empty button component as is for now and import it into the form, because that's what we'll need over here at the top. So I'll say import button, and we can just click on that and it completes the import. And from there, let's put our 3 buttons in the form. So button, and now I'll just use Shift, Alt, and the down arrow to copy that down a couple of more times. So now we have 3 buttons. Let's think about what props go down to the button. I'm going to go ahead and click inside the button and put the props on separate lines. Well, the first thing we could do is set the button text here, much like we would a title. And we'll be able to use that in the future. So let's set the button text, and we'll set that equal to users. And after that, we could go ahead and do the request type equals request type and pass that on through. And then we could do the same with set request type and have that equal set request type. So those are the 3 things we need to pass to each button. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. Let's see actually if we can select the whole thing, and now I can use Shift, Alt, and the arrow. There we go. And I'll just eliminate those earlier buttons we created. But we need to change. We don't want 3 users buttons. So we've got users, then let's go with posts, and finally we'll go with comments as the button text. So now we're passing in the 3 different props that each button needs, and we can go back to the button.js and complete that. So let's destructure those props, and this will be button text, and then it would be request type, and then it's set request type. Now in our button itself, we don't want a div, we actually want a button element. And so this makes sense to go ahead and change those to button. And now on separate lines, we can once again work with the different attributes for a button element. We'll say class name, and let's set that equal to, and here this isn't what you expect. We wouldn't just put a class name and say button. We're going to decide what class it is based on that button text prop. So we'll use the button text, and we'll say if it equals the request type. So if the request type equals users and the button text is users, then we'll use a ternary and say if this is true, we're going to give it a class name of selected. Otherwise, we'll just say null, in other words, no class name. And that will help us as we apply the CSS to show which button is actually selected. From there, we can say type, and here simply button. We don't want a submit type, we want a button type. And then for the click on the button, the on-click event here, we'll put an anonymous function. And with this anonymous function, we'll set the request type. And the request type will be the button text because that's what we've passed. So if it's the users button, we'll set the request type to users. If it is the posts button, we'll set the request type to posts. And that continues to make sense for all 3 buttons. From there, we know we need to put some text on the button, which is just the button text itself here between the opening and closing tags. And we can save our component. So we've completed our button component that's reusable, and we use it 3 times in the form component. And then the form component is imported into the app component, and we see it will be displayed here. So with this much created, and again, it's just the form with 3 buttons, but let's go ahead and open a terminal window. I do that with Control and the backtick button, but you could go to the terminal menu and do it that way as well. And now that we've done that, let's go ahead and start up the dev version of our application by typing npm start and pressing enter. This will take just a moment, but should launch the application. And with the application launched, you can now see the 3 buttons that we have at the very top of the web page. And so far, that's what it is. It's an application with a form and 3 buttons. I'm going to go ahead and select Visual Studio Code and resize it so it kind of is to the left and Chrome is to the right. But we're started, and now that as we work on our application, we'll continue to see the changes over here. I'm going to go ahead and close the terminal window. It will continue to run our application. I'm going to quickly select the index.css. Again, this is focused on React and not CSS, but I'm going to just replace what is currently in the index CSS with mine, and of course I will have this CSS in the repository at GitHub that I'll link to in the description below, so you can copy this over if you want to. But this is just to make the tutorial look a little bit better, and I'm not going to focus on it, and it's really pretty short here. Let me look, like less than 60 lines of CSS. But overall, you can use that from the GitHub repository, link below in the description. Now let's go back to the app. In the app, I'm going to scroll up here just a little bit, and before we set the data or set the items in the fetch items function, I'm going to go ahead and log the data before it is set as an item, and I'll save this, and then I'm also going to right click on Chrome and inspect, and I think I've still got my console down here at the bottom. Yes, let me check and choose console, and yes, we got an array. Let me do that one more time, and there we go, an array of 10 items. It's giving me a warning because it says items is not used at this point in the application, but we are logging the data here, and so it is working. We're getting all the users from JSON placeholder. Now let's work on displaying that data, and of course that will eliminate this warning about items because we'll start using the items in our application. So if we scroll down, all we're going to need below the form component is a list component, and here we'll just pass the items and that little piece of state, which is all of our data, we'll pass that along to the list. And now we need to create the list. If I save right now, we'll get an error. So I'm just going to go over here to the file tree, create a new file, list.js. And now in this list.js, again, Control Alt and the letter R, and it'll be underscore RAFCE. There's our functional list component. I can just save this much, and now I can probably go back to the app.js and save it without getting an error. Well, no, we haven't imported it yet, so we got the error anyway. Import list, and now I can click on list, and it's imported from ./list, and now, will we have an error? Probably not. Let me clear it out and reload once again. If everything is good now, we're still logging the data to the console for now too, so we could go ahead and remove that. I don't want to leave that console log statement in there. Save that and clear out the console, reload. Yes, no data is now showing. Everything is as expected, so now we can go create our list. I'll click on the list file here, and I'm going to press Control B once again to hide the file tree. Now inside the list, we're going to return an unordered list, and we're receiving the items prop, so I'll destructure that right here, and we want to map through the items that we've received. So it will be items.map, and here we'll get an individual item and have an arrow. Now this is a parentheses, not a curly brace, and we can have a line here, and now we're going to use another reusable component, and this will be a list item. So I'll have list item, and list item will need a key because each item in a list as you map through does need a key, and this will be the item.id that we received from JSON placeholder, and then we're going to pass the item down to the list item as well, the full item itself. And that is what our list item will receive. So let's go ahead, show the file tree once again just to create a new file here. And now I'll do that again. I clicked away. There we go. List item with a capital L and a capital I.js. And once again, Control Alt R underscore RAFCE. And now we have our list item component. I'm going to go ahead and change the div to an LI for list item. After that, I'll just save for now, and I'll come back to the list where we can import the list item. And I'll click on that to finish the import. Go ahead and save the list component and go back to the list item component. The list item component is fairly simple. As we can see, we're receiving an item, so we want to destructure that at the top. And if we look over here, we're already mapping through the items. We're just not displaying anything. So we have 10 users. We're seeing 10 dots in Chrome for those users. But all we want to do right now is print out the full object. So we need to use JSON.stringify and then just pass in the item, and this will print out the full object. So if we save, now we see each user in the web page. I'll go ahead and close the console so we can see this much larger. And we're seeing each user because we're on users. Now let's go ahead and click a button and see if it changes to posts. And it does. Now we're seeing each item that comes from the post data. And there's a lot more here for posts. I believe 100 compared to 10 users. And then if we go to comments, there should be even more, as this should be 500 different comments, I believe. So we've got all the data and we're displaying it as we expected to. So that was part A of the challenge. I hope you completed it well, and if not, I hope my walkthrough has helped you complete it. Okay, we're ready for part B of the challenge. You can see we still have our form with the 3 buttons at the top, users, posts, and comments, and we'll still be switching between those 3 resources. But the challenge is to dive deeper than just printing an unordered list. This is a table full of the results, and as you can see, when we click the button, the table changes and we show the different resources. So this is essentially the same, except we're showing a table, and a table requires us to dive deeper into the results. Instead of just printing out the object, now we're going into each property of the object, as you can see, and we have the ID, the name, and so on. Now, the user's object is deeper than just one object. In other words, it has nested objects, as you can see under posts, and then there's even a latitude, longitude, geo object in here. So this is also a consideration as you map through the individual properties of the object. Now I'm going to give a couple of hints again before you complete this challenge. So if you want to go ahead and do this without hearing the hints, pause the video now. And now I can give the hints. The hints for this, you're going to need to map through, of course, each key of the object. And to do that, you're going to use object.entries. And this is just general JavaScript knowledge, not necessarily just about React. So if you don't know how to map through properties of an object, because map usually applies to an array, you need to look up object.entries, maybe try MDN. The other thing to note is that JSON.stringify still applies. If you just specify one property, you don't usually have to use that stringify, but notice there are nested objects inside of the user's resource. When we go to posts and comments, not so much. We don't really have nested objects here, but we do in the users area. So here are the comments again, no nested objects in the comments. But once we go back to users, there we see the nested objects. And also, if you really want to challenge yourself on the CSS, notice that I've now made the form at the top a fixed position, so it stays on the screen as we scroll the table. And you don't see the scroll bar to go right and left with the table until you scroll to the bottom, and then there's the scroll bar. Once again, notice the form at the top stays stationary. So this is all about formatting a table and getting it to work on a page. So just a little extra CSS for the challenge. Okay, I'm going to go over the solution now. So pause the video and work on the challenge first. Okay, we're now looking at the solution for part B of the challenge. And so we need to make some changes. Right now we've got the code for part A. The first thing I'm going to do, notice when I scroll in Chrome that our buttons leave the page here during the part A part of the challenge. I'm just going to go to the CSS real quick and make a couple of changes. One is to make the form that I have a fixed position form so it will stay at the top. And then the other is to use just a little bit of padding at the top and remove these other settings from the unordered list. And you can see what change it will make to part A for the appearance. If I save this, and now it looks the same here, but after saving, those buttons stay where they should be, and we can still scroll the page. So that's a nice change to the initial CSS that I had, and we're going to use these changes as we change this to a table because we'll still want our buttons to stay here and let the table scroll if need be. Okay, moving over to the app now. As we work on the solution for part B, the first thing we need to do in the app is just comment out the list. We're not going to use that for part A anymore, and now we save, and our list should disappear. So a simple change really in the functional app component, all we need to do is change from our list component to a table component. So that is what I called it. You could call it something else if you want, but it just makes sense to call it a table component. Again, we'll just pass the items, just like we did with the list, to the table component. And after that, we need to go ahead and create it, and then I'll come back and save the app file. So I'm going to create a new file here that will be the table component, table.js with a capital T. Press Control, Alt, and R. And now here, I'll do _RAFCE. And now we've got our functional table component. Inside this, it will be just a little bit more complicated than just creating a table element. I'm going to create a container, and this has more to do with formatting the table with CSS so the table can scroll and the header will stay in place, the form that we have at the top of the page. So here I'm going to say class name equals table-container. Now inside this div, I'm going to create a table, and just to keep properly formatted HTML for the table, I'm going to create a T body. We won't have a T head or a header for the table really, but we will have this body. Now inside the table body, we can go ahead and map through the items once again. So we'll have items.map. Whoa, did not mean that for that to happen. Items. Want .map, and so I'm going to now create that without that wrong autocomplete. There we go. And then item arrow function, again a parentheses, not a curly brace there. And now we need a row component. So here I'm not going to put anything yet. I'll just save this. And now back in the table we need to, or not in the table, but back in the app we need to import the table. So we'll do that here at the top. Import table, and I'll click on the table, and we've got that. Now we can go back, and we've got an error because we don't have anything in our map yet. So let's go ahead and add our row component, and this will receive a key, which will be the item.id, and then it's also going to receive the full item itself. So we'll pass that item into the row. And now let's close out the row component, and we also need to destructure items up here above. We haven't done that yet. And now if we save, we'll probably still get an error because we haven't created the row yet, and that is what I expected. So now let's go create this row component by creating one more new file here, row with a capital R.js, and now Control Alt and the letter R, and we'll have _RAFCE. And here we have our row. It receives the item, and the table row needs a TR, not a div, so we'll make this a table row. And now inside the row, we need to go ahead and step through or map through each key of the different objects that we're receiving. And this is where it's different than just listing them all out as a JSON string with JSON stringify as we did in part A. So now we need object.entries, and we pass in item. I'm going to go ahead and press Control B once again to hide the file tree and get a little more room. So object.entries, pass in the item, then .map, and now inside of here we can say key value. Oh, I don't want that parentheses there, so I've got one parentheses, and then our arrow function. And now this allows us, this object.entries, pass in the item, and then call map, and then we're destructuring the key and the value of each different property as we go through. So then here we can reference each one of these and return, oops, not a curly brace, we need a parentheses. We can return a value here, and we're going to use one more reusable component. And as you might guess, in a table, we've got a row. This will be a data cell. I'm just going to call it cell, and here it will once again need a key, which is already defined, as each pair has a key and a value. And then I'll set the cell data, is what I'll call this, equal to JSON.stringify, and I'll pass in the value. And the reason we're doing this with JSON-Stringify is because some of these values are nested objects themselves from the user resource. They're not so much from the posts or the components. I didn't see any nested objects there. But with the user resource, I did see nested objects, so we still need to stringify to go ahead and print that out to the page. And then in that regard, the address field will have an object printed in that cell. I'm going to go ahead and save this file so we can import the row into the table component. Here we go, import row. This will be from./row. Save that and then show the file tree once again just to create our cell.js, which will be our last functional component. Control-Alt, the letter R, underscore RAFCE. And now that we have the cell, it is receiving the cell data. And once we get the cell data, instead of a div, we need a TD, as you would have in an HTML table. And now we can just put the cell data inside because we've already stringified it in the previous component before we passed it down through the props. So now we've got cell data here, and we need to go back to our row and import our cell component, which is probably why we're getting an error over there. Say import cell. There we go. I'll click on that and save. And now we've got all kinds of errors over here. Let's reload and see if that once again happens. Nope, it's all good. It just took a second to process. So now we have our full table printing out. Let me go ahead and expand Chrome. We can see the full table here. So as we click posts, it changes and it puts the posts in the table. As we click comments, it changes and puts the comments in the table. And as I click users, it goes back. And here you can see the nested objects I was talking about, such as in the address field. There's also one over here. So there's a few different areas. Now to scroll the table, instead of seeing the scroll right away as we would on a web page, we scroll to the bottom and then we're scrolling inside that table container that I made. And so you'll see those changes in the CSS. There's not much to it, but it certainly helps control a table and keep any kind of heading you have at the top, and that works out just fine. So that is the challenge B. I hope you did well. You may have done better than I did. One thing I would change if I was doing this in a serious project is I would flatten out our data objects such as users, so I wouldn't go ahead and put an object in here. And if you're curious about how to flatten out nested objects, I show a function that does exactly that at the end of my recursion tutorial. So if you are, or maybe if you are not yet familiar with recursion, go ahead and check out that tutorial. I'll give a link below as well, so you could flatten this out, and then every piece of data here would receive its own cell. Hey, thank you guys so much for liking the video if it helped you get started with React. Also, I appreciate you watching and subscribing. It's helping my channel grow. Take care, and I'll see you again very soon.